everyone. Welcome to the Self-Care for Performers. Let's try that again. She's nervous. Hi there, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is Marissa Moses, and I am your host of the Self-Care for Performers podcast. I'm so excited to be able to launch this podcast during Mental Health Awareness Month in May of 2022. It's been a hard couple of years for us in the world with the pandemic and a lot of social unrest. And there is greater need than ever that I felt in my community, especially those of us with marginalized identities that perhaps either lack the resources and tools or just face more adversity in the world, and so therefore require more resources and tools to connect to a sense of self-care, self-trust, relational wellness, embodied creativity, and having a sense of mindfulness with an integrative experience of our body as well as our awareness of it. What I come through the lens of very specifically with this project, Self-Care for Performers, is aligning to that which has been silenced in your body, in the bodies of cultural narratives, in the connection to knowing that we are all embedded into some form of an oppressive paradigm, and we all have history, likely, of internalized abuse, and perhaps have been perpetrators of some form of relational misconduct. From that lens and perspective, I hope to create an open dialogue with ourselves, about ourselves, and with one another, about our communities, in a way that can be relational, oriented towards healing, deeply attuned to the marginalized, the victimized, the hurt parts of ourselves and our communities, while also being honest about our shortcomings, our flaws in perception, our challenges in embodied empathy, and our fear of righteous rage that may desire an outlet for a more activist spirit. I hope to connect to the heart so that we can break the curse that a white supremacist, Christian colonial, elitist perspective has placed upon the hearts, heads, and bodies of those of us who don't fit into the mold or the paradigm that upholds the narcissistic, psychological framework of modern day society and industry standards that we live, work, create, and relate within, and all the fear of the other that keeps us othering ourselves. And with that, I welcome you into the first episode. I have a very special guest, and I'm so excited to introduce you. Today, I have a lovely guest and a dear friend, Roksana, who is joining us, who is a classically trained pianist and opera singer. She is now writing and developing and performing in a pop band with her boyfriend, living a beautiful, radiant life, also as a vocal instructor. She has a lovely piano music project that she's been in development with. And I'd love to chat with her and introduce her to you and get to know a little bit about her background and her relationship to self-care as a performing artist. Welcome, Roksana.
Thank you, Marissa, for that lovely intro of all my hats that I wear. So happy to be here with you. Always love being with you in your space that you create for performers and for friends and seekers of intuitive truths. So really lovely to be here with you.
I love that, seeker of intuitive truths. That is very much kind of my core heart mission.
Yes, it is. And so is mine. I think that's where we connect.
Yes, I would second that for sure. I think there's a depth of presence that I find when I'm in your company that feels really good to be met with, like a match card with that kind of intentionality.
Thank you.
So I'd love for you to introduce a little bit of your background for the listener who maybe this is their first time getting to know you. Would you tell us a little bit about just who you are, where you come from, as if you are meeting someone for the first time and you're just kind of giving them a window into the historical context of your intersections of identity that feel prevalent right now?
Where do we begin? let's start in the present and then we go backwards. So I live in Los Angeles and I'm an artist and teacher. My current projects are kind of like a psychedelic rock dream pop duo called Zeinapur that I developed with my boyfriend, as you mentioned, David Labovich, who is a guitarist and composer. And then I also have a solo piano project named Time Interior, and it's sort of very meditative, cinematic piano scapes. And then I also teach piano and voice. I have my own studio practice that I run called Z Vocal Studio and Dickens Music, where I work with kids and adults and teach them how to be musicians. And that's sort of the present reality. And then as we unravel backwards, the last 10 years or so, I have spent pursuing a career in opera. And that has taken me around the world and around the country and has been a very rich and rewarding experience. But ultimately, I had the clarity to see that it was time to pursue something slightly different. Quarantine was sort of that time for me where I could step away from that world because the world was on pause and see if I could do something different. And before I was doing classical voice, I was actually, when I was in school, I was trained as a classical pianist. And that was sort of my first musical upbringing. I've been playing piano since I was 7 years old. It's something that is, I mean, here I'm sitting next to my piano. It's like the one corner of my apartment that's always going to look nice. So I'm here. It's such a big part of my life, but also at this point, it's sort of kind of casual. And it's not like, you know, if you're a classical pianist, you spend hours practicing and you do all these things. And I used to do that. And now I don't. And it's kind of lovely to not have that kind of workout mentality when it comes to piano specifically, where if I want to play, I can play. If I don't want to play, I don't play. And it's no longer this meaty, sort of ambitious pursuit. So that was the beginning of my creative work. And I was born in Latvia, Northeast Europe, former Soviet Union. And my family is Russian and Persian on my dad's side and Russian on my mom's side. And I grew up in Latvia and Riga speaking Russian. And then my family immigrated to US when I was in high school. I was 14. So I finished high school in the States and then I moved to Los Angeles and have been here since. And this is kind of where I feel the most at home, really. Everywhere I've been and everywhere I've traveled and performed, I come home to LA and it feels like, oh, this is a place for me. This is where it doesn't matter, or at least to me, it feels like it doesn't matter where I'm from and it doesn't matter really what I'm doing. As long as I'm creative and ambitious, it's kind of the vibe here and I really enjoy that. So I think they answered all your questions.
That was lovely. Thank you for the rich background. I think that you and I have spoken before about telling the history of who we are and how sometimes it helps you to start in the present and move backwards because that's how you remember it. Am I remembering?
And also it feels like what's most relevant is what's happening now. It's something that we have talked about before. Having a background in something that's like a high art form, it can really sort of take over your life and make you feel like no matter what you're doing, you're still that mezzo soprano or that classical pianist. And I'm sort of relieved not to be in that part of my life anymore where I can be all these other things and say, yes, I have a background in classical music, but it's no longer an all-consuming sort of obsession slash endeavor that I'm constantly around. It's kind of nice to be doing something that is less all-encompassing, you know?
Yeah.
Something almost feels a little bit more casual now when I make art, you know?
I do. And I feel like there's something really lovely that a lot of creatives can deepen into. And I do read a lot in some of the books that I've read by different creatives about developing a spiritual practice with your creativity. And at some point, you know, you do show up again and again ritualistically, but at the same time, finding some sort of like ease or curiosity or flow, as opposed to the potentially more rigid, all-encompassing, very rigorous, kind of dynamic. And you taught about almost like an obsessive kind of experience. Can you express a little bit about, because I think there are probably going to be a lot of performing artists out there that perhaps are either newer into their craft or very deep into their craft that are really feeling maybe the obsessive kind of experience. What did that feel like in your body? What was your experience of that mentally, physically, emotionally?
Such a great question. Something I really would love to talk about. It's like, where do I even start? I think now that I'm sort of past that stage in my life, I can look back and I can really acknowledge that what I was doing was a deep healing work. Really, in that singing specifically, because it's so physical and so personal, was an opportunity for me to spend hours every single day working on my voice, working on my body, working on this music. It was kind of like hypertherapy, where I could really focus on myself in a way that I couldn't in any other asset of my life. And now that I know what therapy is and I'm aware of therapy, when I was younger, it wasn't something that therapy was for crazy people. Like that, I just didn't know what a gift it was to actually have therapy or have healing therapeutic experiences. So the only thing I allowed myself to be my therapy was singing, because it allowed me to really focus on how I felt physically and how I felt psychologically. And how I felt wasn't great. It wasn't great at all. It was a lot of pain. There was a lot of physical pain that was in, a lot of psychological and emotional pain and inner conflict. In some ways, singing reinforced it, where it was kind of self-flagellation in some ways, but in other ways, it also allowed me to unpack things, because I was forced to, because you can't communicate well if you're tense and frustrated and just kind of confused about who you are. So it's like I was forced to heal and to become a healthier person because my craft depended on it. So I think that self-obsession was in a way a gift, where I had the time and the focus to really look at myself honestly and give myself things that I needed, even though in my mind it was always for the sake of my career, for the sake of my singing, for the sake of my future. Like I think that's how I tricked myself into doing self-care and self-healing, is because if I just told myself, oh, I just need to heal for the sake of healing, I would have dismissed that and be like, that's indulgent or that's irrelevant, you know? So in a way, it was a gift where it allowed me to unpack a lot of things. And I had a lot of things to unpack. There was a lot of trauma and a lot of dysfunction and dysregulation that I had come from, that I didn't even know these terms. And no one, around me talked about these things. Like I said, therapy was for crazy people. It was like either you were okay or you were like crazy. There was nothing in between. And through going through all these lessons and acting classes and various embodied practices that performers can practice, I was learning to slowly peel the layers of the onion and to come to terms with how I truly felt about myself, about other people, about what life was, and I was lucky that I had those 10 years of doing that work. I think it was a gift. And now when I teach, it's funny, just earlier this evening, I was working with a student who, as she was getting ready for the lesson, and she was kind of flustered because she wasn't really prepared. And she was like, I have to tell you something. I'm going through a divorce and it's ugly and it's, and I was like, you know what? And she was basically like excusing herself from practicing. And I was like, I don't care if you practice. I really, truly don't care if you practice. I care that we're here now. I'm here, you're here. We have an hour. Let's do it now. Whatever it is that you need to do, you will do it and I will guide you. You're not here to perform for me, nor are you here to pass some kind of exam, So it's like I sort of see that other people, everyone does it, and now as a teacher, I can also hold that space for people and be like, I see that there's something going on in your life that's very difficult to process. And I understand that really I'm here not so much for the music, but just to give you an hour where you can focus on yourself and do something that's not all these things that are challenging you.
Yeah.
So
there's a lot in there.
There's a lot in there. And I think because I did it for myself, I can now do it for other people as a teacher. And I have no problem doing that. It doesn't bother me at all if that's the situation,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a couple of things that you touched on that I'd love to kind of return to a little bit. And the first one is this stigma we have around what is a crazy person and what is the experience of needing help or support. A very clear something that can help us mentally or even somatically in our body when we're experiencing something. And I think that, there's a lot of stigma that a lot of cultural narratives and general washes of the storytelling that wash over the experience of having a very different experience of how your mind works and how you take in and then redeliver information from your body that aren't really supported, welcomed, and can sometimes be very much at odds with, to the point where things become very uncomfortable in many different kinds of ways for people who need a different kind of connection or support system. And I think a lot of us are much more divergent than we admit or show or often express. And having to mask that, having to pretend that we're more quote unquote normal than we truly are experiencing can be part of, I think, what creates the need to go into the healing to begin with, right? If we're not being met as we are for who we are with the needs we have that might not be societally expected, anticipated, or quote quote unquote easy enough for our families who had their own sets of their own stuff that they were working through. But I love that because these days, like there's a lot of pop psychology now, there's a lot of talk of mental health and wellness that is there. And I think we're starting to normalize the experience of, you know, just like you go to the doctor, or you go to the dentist, or
you go to
you go to the gym. You have a regimen where and tools and resources that can help you with some sort of like a hygiene.
Exactly. I love that word. Yeah.
You know, you brush your teeth so you don't get cavities, and you go to the dentist in case some come anyways. And I think mental health is absolutely something similar. And depending on the kind of mental health support you're getting, I think it's also some different systems are like, well, how do we listen to what's there? And how do we give voice to it? How do we find support for that? And others are like, well, how do we see how much you do or don't fit into the framework of society? And can we make you match society a little bit more? And I have my certain leanings towards what does and doesn't feel best to me, but depending on where somebody's mentality is or their comfortability and how much they've connected to messaging that they've gotten from their families or from television or from, you know, news sources that feed a certain kind of idea of what a quote unquote crazy person is, or how diverse and complex we all are and how we all have different needs, that's going to land on all of our listeners, I think, a little bit differently. And I'm aware of that. And so, which is kind of why I wanted to just like address the term to begin with, because I think there's a lot to just unpack around the term crazy. The ways in which I've seen so many members of my family, my friends, myself included, not seek or get the help or the support that they needed because they were afraid of being seen a certain way or seeing themselves a certain way, or admitting that they were having certain kind of challenges because they didn't know how that would be met. And I think that it's a beautiful outlet. And I think one, because that's a very true and real thing that some people face. I think a lot of performing artists are also drawn into the performing arts, similar to what you expressed, which is there's some sort of an urge, some sort of a desire, some sort of a calling to make sense and heal through a lot of the traumas or the woundings or the pains that we have gone through, and have some sort of an outlet to integrate back into like a sense of a self that we don't want to escape from anymore. Do you align with that? Agree with that?
100%, 100%. That's exactly what the rigorous training that I've underwent gave me the opportunity to do, to really face these things that I otherwise wouldn't have the attention and the intention of facing, because they're quite uncomfortable, you know?
Yeah, of course. You said earlier about holding space for your student and knowing that sometimes that's why you came to the arts, to see that that's sometimes why some of your students come to the arts.
Especially adults, like kids. I mean, kids do it too, but they're less aware of what's really going on. For the adults that I work with, more and more I am aware that it is a form of therapy for them, you know, and I'm perfectly happy to facilitate that process for them, you know?
Yeah, it's like intentionally therapeutic.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know that because you and I met actually through doing embodiment practices. Do you want to chat a little bit about how you also do offer that as well? I know that I know this is definitely like a depth calling for you. You've expressed to me, but I also know it's kind of like a tender spot because there's so much vulnerability in that kind of work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And thank you for bringing it up. And it is how we met. We were in this workshop together. It's kind of somatic embodiment workshop that was called Walking in Your Shoes. And that has been a really, really important part of my life since I've learned how to do it. And I used to do it regularly. Quarantine sort of changed things, where I would host a group at home where we would come together and take turns sort of embodying the things that we individually needed, and also things that could help the group. And that's something that I keep trying to move into a more sort of organized way, where I host more public meetings and public groups, but I think I'm just not ready for it right now. And I think a time will come when it's something that I do more regularly. And I also do it with performers. I've done it a couple of times with company Talco, Independent Opera Company, and a friend of mine, Lisa Barskaya, is the director there, and she's invited me a few times for their productions to work with the singers and practice this embodiment before they start staging. And that has been a really great experience for me also, and for them as performers, to have a somatic approach to their work as performers. And I think opera singers are particularly sort of curious in that, because it is a more traditional art form and people don't always know about these somatic and and embodiment practices, like in a world of theater, I think they're more accepted and more readily available, and opera is still kind of more old-fashioned, where people just don't know that you could have somatic practices as a part of your performance life, you know?
Yeah.
So that's something that it is very important to me, both as a performer and also in a personal way, because I think it's a practice that ultimately is there for personal growth and development and for connection with one's intuition.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very, very important to me.
It's beautiful to see on the stage too, when performers are actively connecting to their intuition while embodying their character, their role. And just for the listeners too, who don't know what embodiment and somatics are, so soma means body. So somatic works are really works that are body based, as opposed to, you think it and then you do it. It's sort of, you listen to your body, and your body sort of is more the directive, and your connection with the body is sort of what is going to be the inspirational initiation, I guess. For the movement or the vocalization or the experience. And embodiment is like you are inside of your body, right? You are connecting into your body. And there's a lot of different kinds of embodiment practices. There are some very spiritually driven embodiment practices, some women who are wanting to embody their sensuality or sexuality and feel more alive and free there. There's walking in your shoes, which is all about connecting to embodied empathy. So you are stepping into an idea or an experience of something or someone that you might want to connect more to or learn more about from a place of curiosity. And you step into the embodiment of it to see what comes from there, sort of like stepping into a role in a kind of way, right? But the main framing is that you are coming from sitting inside of yourself very clearly. There's something related to the body, and there's a way of being inside of your experience with it, or being in relationship to it at minimum. Does that track for you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. This kind of work is sometimes hard to verbalize because it is physical. It's not so much about the vocabulary, it's about the experience of it, So sometimes it feels like we're going in circles talking about it. But I think the only thing I would add is it's a practice of listening to your own impulses, which for me, when I first started doing it, I realized I wasn't. I was so numb to my own basic impulses, physical and psychological and intuitive, stepping into these characters or these ideas and these concepts, even though it had nothing to do with me. It taught me to listen to them. And then I had to listen to myself. And I had to really learn to be like, oh, that's the impulse to be angry, or that's the impulse to be sensual, or that's the impulse to hold back or to be more active, And I think that is such a powerful thing, just to be aware of your own impulses and ideas and desires, and not to contain them, just to allow them to exist and allow them to express themselves. And they will always yield something unexpected, something that you didn't really plan, And so I think that practice for me really changed me, changed my life, and changed the way I approach creativity, where I do feel like it comes from somewhere else, wherever it is, whatever vocabulary people put on that, the supernatural or the intuitive or the spiritual. There's so many ways of talking about it, and they all have to do with our backgrounds and our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. But practicing walking really was a spiritual experience for me, and a kind of a supernatural experience, and a supernatural experience where I was the supernatural thing. It wasn't some deity or some practice. It was me as a part of a supernatural force, which was really, really wild to experience that, and to really not just talk about it, but to experience it in your body, going back to what you were saying, where you are inside of it. And that's what it feels like,
Yeah, I do. That particular tone that you're touching into, it's not some outside deity, it's you. You're the experience of the force of the field, of just as you're connecting to it. I've done a lot of studying to figure out what are different kinds of spiritual frameworks that people utilize to make sense of the seen and the unseen. Right? Because there are things we can see and there's things we can't see. And then some things science helps us make sense of, and something science is like, we're still confused here, or there's a lot of wacko possibilities. And
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I like to think of entering and exiting this space, or even just continuing to perpetually learn how to work with it all the time, right? It becomes sort of a way of engaging as an ever presence, that there is a kind of way that the mystery stays mysterious and also becomes fully known at the same time. I don't know That makes sense.
Oof, love that. Oh, I love that so much.
Mm.
That's how it is. That's how it is. That's exactly how it is. The mystery stays mysterious, but also is known. And that's why it feels so full and so satisfying to experience that, because you're like, I know there's something going on here and I don't quite know what it is, and I don't need to know because I'm already experiencing it, you know?
Yeah. And for me, I've been teaching and leading it. So my whole life, like my background has been just wildly steeped in artists since I was a little girl. And I feel very fortunate in many ways for that. But also it's been a very complex experience to try to make sense of my world, my engagement with the world. The more I talk about this stuff, the more I find other people have similar experiences. They just either don't talk about it or they don't know how to talk about it. Yeah.
Don't know how to talk about it. Yeah.
So this is something that, like, with self-care for performers, I am trying to bridge a space for myself where I can be more vocal about this, because I do recognize the more I share, the more other people start to feel like, oh, maybe they could share too. And at the same time, it's a very tender, vulnerable space. And at the same time, a lot of those of us who have tested waters in that space growing up, or in a connection to a creative opportunity or experience, we haven't been met with the witness, the support, the safety, the compassion, the encouragement or celebration that we would need to deepen into that with more breadth, I guess. And so it's challenging, because I find that when people are excited and encouraged to move into there, it can be so fun. It's like a little bud in spring, like getting ready to blossom. And they're so delicate, they're so fragile. And if a big gust of wind comes along or a frost comes, like, there goes the bud. And I think that the beauty of nature is that doesn't mean that the plant can't come back again, right? If we're the plant, not just the flower, like if we're constantly have the opportunity to grow, and that if our environment is set up to help us thrive, that we have more opportunities to thrive. And yes, there are plants and people who are very resilient and can thrive in really challenging circumstances. There's still going to be certain kinds of climates, environments, ecosystems that are going to be more naturally healthy for different human bodies and different kinds of plant varieties, right? And that we are all so different, and it's okay if some plants live better in the snow and others.
Exactly. We're in the desert. Yeah.
Right. And just like that with performing artists, I think similarly, when we can start to tune into, like, listening to those instincts you were talking about earlier, like, how do I even listen to myself? Because we are so often, I think there's this framework coming back to that, like, classically trained, all-encompassing kind of experience. If we carry that metaphor of, like, people are like plants, right? Performing artists can continue to grow and find new outlets that are maybe more compatible to their natural, fertile spaciousness. That there is a kind of specific type of ecosystem that is present in that kind of a training. And perhaps where you were at in that time, it was exactly what you needed, because you needed something that was rigid enough, framed enough, controlled enough, that you felt safe enough to connect to the really wounded parts of yourself and try to soften through them and find a way to heal, even as you were potentially opening some things that you wouldn't have been willing to open otherwise if it didn't happen in that context.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. Like, I understand that it was sort of an excuse to heal, even though I was like doing it for my career, and thank God I had this fantasy of a career that it gave me the opportunity to heal. It was such a gift, because so many of us are just too busy and too overwhelmed with life to really take the time and commit to the deep work that it takes to truly heal from things,
Yeah. And tell us where you're at now in relationship to what you've learned. This is a self-care for performers podcast. Where's your self-care these days, and how are your overall framework to caring about yourself?
Oh, that's such a great question as well. It's interesting because now I'm doing something quite different. I am in a psychedelic rock band, and I'm writing it with my boyfriend, and there isn't this kind of like classical thing. And yet once the quarantine ended and we got out there and start to perform and try to book gigs, I felt myself snap right back into the old sort of mental habits and physical habits. And I had to be like, oh my gosh, it's not opera, it's me. I'm the one who is constantly stressing myself out and pushing myself into corners. So now I'm really actively trying to pursue a more relaxed way of being an artist and a more relaxed way of being a person, where I don't put so much pressure on myself. And my first priority is my well-being as opposed to my career or my success as a performer, because I'm really realizing it's just not worth it. It's not worth it becoming super successful and super whatever if your day to day is still feeling very tight and constrained and stressed out and feeling like you have to satisfy all these people's ideas about what you should be doing. So I'm allowing myself to take the time that I need with projects, and that's both on the creative end of things and on the logistical marketing business end of things, because that's really the challenging part for me, is the being an artist and being your own sort of label manager, all of that.
Yeah, a lot of hats.
And if it takes me 3 months to do something that I thought was going to take a week, then I just sort of allow it to be that way. And I don't freak out about it the way I would maybe a year ago. And I think if that's what it takes for me to do this in a way that feels okay, then that's what it has to be. And that is something that is hard for me because there's the part of me that is, that chose the rigorous arts still wants to sort of take the whip out and use it on my own back. And I'm trying not to do that. And then the other thing is I'm really allowing myself to be at the center of my creative experience, where I'm not really working for a director or a conductor or vocal coach, or I'm not going on auditions. It's really just me with my partner, and we are most of the time on the same page. And if we're not, we sort of take time to navigate creative differences, but it's really our own ideas and our own desires, which is so exciting to be in that part of your life where you're like, well, what do I have to say? What is it? It's really just me. There's no script, there's no score, there's no casting director. It's me. And I don't know if that really ties into self-care, but
I think it does. I mean, personally, I find that there's such a self-caring component to being brave enough to share from the center of yourself, which is sort of what I heard you say, was that you're really focusing on being at the center of your creativity and your performance practices. There's a lot of bravery and there's a lot of care about your story, about your voice, about your creative instincts that I think are coupled with that relationship. And if you don't have a self-caring dynamic with who you are, like if you are I guess I should say this, it sounds like you're also choosing to not take the whip out and, to make yourself do things that you're not ready to do, that you don't feel like is either a right match or it's just not the right time. And that what I hear is because we have so many different hats when this is an approach we take, like we're our own marketer, our own producer, our own director, your own singer, songwriter, and to wear all those hats and have all the different kinds of skills that go along with executing those different roles, the actions that need to happen in order to fill those roles. It takes a lot of dexterity, I think, as well as coming back and coming back and coming back to the center of who you are and remembering like the why, the who, the how, the integrity, the reason, that sort of heart space that you and I both connected to at the beginning of our chat of like, intuited heart, like heart-centered intuition or something. I can't remember what you said, but it was lovely.
I don't even remember saying that, but I believe it.
Yeah,
it really is the aim of all of this work, is self-care ultimately, isn't it?
I think so.
Like, I think that's what we're all trying to do. So might as well really commit to that.
Yeah.
And not fool yourself by thinking, once I have the creative project or once I have the recognition, then I can take care and then I can slow down. I'm really reframing all that. And I think quarantine for me was a gift where I was sort of forced to lay low, and I really enjoyed it. And I thought, oh my gosh, what if I can organize my life in a way where I'm just moving at a slower pace a little bit and my own pace? What would life look like? And I'm very much trying to figure that out still. What does life look like if I really call the shots?
Yeah.
And it's a continuous process. And we're always different. Every day we're different people. Some days we have more energy and more ambition and aggression, and other days we need to really take it easy. So think that's also part of self-care, is honoring those cycles and those impulses to do this or that. Because if you don't, the work you make is not even that good. It's like you spent all the energy doing something and it wasn't even that good. And you should have just stayed in bed all day and then at least got rest. You know what I mean? So yeah.
Yeah. I love that you talk about cycles and pacing, because I think that we all work in our own sense of cycles and our own sense of pacing. And depending on where we are at in the phase of life we're in, we might have a different kind of calling to work at a different pace or at a different kind of cyclical turnover. But ultimately, like collectively, like we have sped up so much as like a human species in a very short amount of time. I think that our bodies are acclimating and also potentially revolting for some of us against the really fast-paced hustle culture experience that we are often asked to show up into in performing arts industries or in certain kinds of training or in capitalism in general or in the concept of like coming to market, right? And I mean, there's a lot of things that I want to say around that, but I also like coming back to the self-care component that you mentioned about it all really being about self-care. And I was like, yeah, I totally agree. And it's taken me a while to really figure out like, well, what is self-care? Right. And like philosophically, I'm realizing for myself and how I'm wanting to connect to the heart of it, it really is like, well, you care about yourself and you have a self. And because you have a self, you can then care about others too.
Exactly.
But until we have a connection to safety and care and connection to ourselves, it's not that we can't care for others. It's just that the desire to connect can sometimes be coming from a place of unmet needs from our early childhood, or from feeling like a sense of desperation to be in connection in a certain way that we haven't had before, or that we're trying to outsource some sort of relationship to that sort of that mystery of it all, right? To try to find it from someone else to give us the answers, you know, as a seeker, as a finder, looking for something. But what I love about this embodiment work that you and I have been doing together for many years now and have been practicing on our own as well, is so much of it for me, my experience of it is inside of my body. I have access to navigational system that helps me find what is going to be a right or a better fit for me, and being willing to say yes when it's a real yes and no when it's a no. And maybe I'm not sure, or I need more time, or not yet. Those are things that have come really hard to me. And I think that depending on, again, all bodies are different and all of our identities are so complex, but depending on the kind of body that you were brought into the world in, saying no might not have been an option.
Absolutely.
Or how you were raised, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. And as a performing artist too, coming back to like the cultural narrative of the performing arts industries, is so often we are really taught either explicitly or implicitly that we need to show up always ready, not really second guess the people that are in charge, but just try to shift our relationship to figure out how to give them what they need and to serve the story. And luckily, I think a lot of really wonderful conversations that are starting to be had and changes in the industry that are being not only asked for, but in many cases demanded, that are taking a look at deconstructing a lot of the narratives that lead in the direction of the performing artist being either subservient to a power or not having agency to say no, or being forced or pressured or coerced into something they don't want to do. And I think that the more we give ourselves permission to say no to ourselves, the more we can understand what it's like to have the world not fall apart when we say a no. And the more we practice saying no to people who, you know, like I say no to you, you say no to me, we both honor each other's no's, it's okay. You know, you can practice starting to say and set boundaries with people where the no's, or the I need more information, or the not in this way, can be an invitation to actually come into deeper intimacy and connection and alignment and compatibility, as opposed to being something that completely ruptures the relationship and the dynamic between you and the other. And that's something that I definitely am fostering more and more in my both creative and personal relationships, as well as my relationship relationship with myself. That's sort of like also one of the core components of what I consider self-care, caring about yourself enough to be with the truth of your no, or of your yes when your yes is uncomfortable. Sometimes that's something too, you know?
Yeah, someone told me once that if you can never say no to someone, then you can't really say yes to them either. 100%. That it takes both. And I think, and I don't know if that's maybe as a woman, like with my background coming from sort of like Eastern European Russian background, where women just were sort of taught to be more agreeable and less assertive in a way, even though I know that stereotype is that Russian women are very aggressive, but I think compared to the Russian men, there is a, that's something I definitely was brought up with, where you don't say no and you don't cause problems and you don't want to be difficult. That's, you know, the last thing you want is you just always want to be agreeable.
Yeah.
And how abusive that really is to a person to take away their agency to say no, because it's such a normal part of life. And I think if we as a society had healthy ways of saying no to each other, maybe there wouldn't be war, maybe there wouldn't be crime. I don't know, maybe that's an idealistic way of saying it, but it's like, maybe these are just people who didn't know how to say no, so they picked up a gun instead, you know, because those are the only options they had. I don't know if that's true, but I do think that being able to say no in a organic, harmonious way is a really important part of life, to yourself and then to others as well, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know that a lot of wars, inner and outer conflict, right, often comes from not being able to be met in your needs and not having access to certain resources, right? There's often a push for either power dynamic or access to resources, limited resources. And I know that there are a lot of cultures that exist in harmony with themselves and with the relationship to their ecosystem and each other, that they are able to find sustainability. And I think that there's been a lot of erasure of those kinds of stories and a lot of the narratives that we have access to, again, in this sort of colonized Western society, that I'm hoping more and more are brought onto the screen or onto the stage or into our dreams and into the books that we read and, you know, into the conversations that we have. Because I think the stories of the archetypes and the myths that we have as reference in our subconscious mind or in the place that we just automatically go, like, we're going to paint the world through those eyes. And then that's sort of going to be the world that we are inhabiting. And it's not that those same archetypes disappear if you have other ones come in, but you at least have other options to have different potential outcomes, right? And different potential ways of being in relationship with yourselves or one another. And coming back to that sort of great mystery where it's mysterious, but it's also known and you are it, but it also is ever present. That there's sort of this sort of webbing of life that I know a lot of animistic spiritual practices connect to that framework, which is animism is sort of the way that most indigenous cultures across the world sort of have connected to the ways in which they connect to spirituality that seem to be relatively consistent. And there is definitely a kind of a interconnected oneness that seems to be present there from the research and the experiences that I've had in relationship to before we tried to control or dominate or decide that something was controlling or dominating us or the earth or nature or each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, all cultures make sense. We all have our different creation stories and our different, like, how to make your way through community stories or society stories. And like community versus society, I think, are also interesting parallels to think about the difference between the two. And our relationship to self-care changes, I think, depending on how we're viewing the landscape that we're entering into.
That's true.
Yeah.
These are all things that I feel like made me aware of. I've been watching you do this work for the last couple of years, specifically the self-care work. And it's like things that I think I've known, but they weren't really, like, you made it more obvious and more verbalized all of these ideas that I haven't necessarily been thinking of, which is really wonderful to hear you develop that into like a practice and to kind of organized and coherent, which I like being able to be like, oh yeah, what is self-care, and what are these cultural practices, and what are these things that we've inherited, and how do we interpret these things? So thank you for bringing them to our attention.
Well, you're so welcome. That's so sweet of you. Well, would you like to tell our listeners where they can find you? Because this has been such a beautiful chat, and I want to be mindful of our agreed upon connection time, which we're coming to a close with. Is there any last little bits you'd like to share? And I'm curious if you could share with them how to keep in touch.
That is great. Yeah, I definitely want people to keep in touch. 2 projects that I'm currently developing. The first one is called Zeinapur, which is just my last name. It's spelled Zeinapur. And under that title, we have a lot of music out on the streaming platforms and music videos on YouTube and social media accounts on TikTok and Instagram and all of that. So you could find me on Zeinapur. And also my other project is Time Interior, which also is on streaming platforms and YouTube, social media links. So you can find that work, which is sort of more meditative, classical piano work. And then my work as a teacher is on zvocalstudio.com. What else? It's like I do so many different things. I think these are the main ways of contacting me if you want to be in touch. And yeah, and all of those links will have performance dates and release dates and sort of new upcoming things that are in the works.
Oh, lovely. Well, I'll link it all in the show notes. And so that you guys can just hop on over there if you didn't get any of that while you were listening, and you'll have access to that at your own leisure. Thank you, Roksana, so much for
Thank you, Marissa,
being here with me. This has been so wonderful, and I will see you again soon. For the listeners, I'm sure you will be hearing her voice again at some point, roll back on as a guest down the line after I get a couple other people in my community in for some juicy talks about self-care, creative connection for performing artists and our community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Today's episode features music by Time Interior, a solo piano project by Roksana Zeinapur. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Selfcare for Performers podcast. If you'd like to stay connected to the different ways in which you can be involved with this project, follow Selfcare for Performers on Instagram, or reach out to me directly at selfcareforperformers@gmail.com. I would love to connect with you and see how we might best be able to work with one another. Looking forward to fostering a beautiful and enriching community with each and every one of you. Be well.